All righty. Here we go.
We are live on Facebook.
Oops. So welcome everyone to Testing Mammon, Learning Financial Discipleship, presented by Stephen Tomlinson. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director for leadership resources at the Episcopal Church Foundation. So glad that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening via Zoom and via Facebook Live for this webinar. Just a quick word for those of you who may not be familiar with the Episcopal Church Foundation. ECF was founded in 1949 as an independent lay-led organization. We are dedicated to strengthening the leadership, strategic, and financial capabilities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other organizations such as camps and conference centers, charities, and religious orders. We do this through a variety of programs, including capital campaigns, endowment management services, plan giving, strategic solutions, our fellowship partners program, our publications, including ECF Model Practices, which I hope you all subscribe to, and books such as the Vestry Resource Guide and Plan Giving on Demand. If you haven't already, please check out our website, episcopalfoundation.org, for more information about all of these programs and for other resources. So without further ado, I will hand things over to our presenter this evening.
Good evening. Welcome to Testing Mammon. My name is Stephen Tomlinson. I'm a professor at the Seminary of the Southwest. And I want to give you a little context for tonight's webinar before we start tackling Mammon head-on. I am an economist by training. I was a professor at the University of Texas. I taught finance and economics for almost 20 years. And all the time that I was studying money, I was also being formed as a disciple of Jesus Christ and asking myself how the energy and excitement that surrounds making money, participating in business, all the things that are part of our stewardship of our gifts in the world, how that is related to the expression of stewardship of our spiritual resources. And those of us who are formed in a life of prayer and study of the scripture and practice with one another in communities of faith, what does money and the world of money have to do with discussed in the article in the Vital Practices? Tonight we're going to do a digging into some of the ideas in that article, and I hope that what you'll take from this webinar is some ideas for how you can do your own small experiments around money so as to determine what spiritual power it has in your life, where you might be able to find alternatives to that power in the God of Jesus Christ, and how you might start asking a different set of questions around your experience with money so that you can become aware of its power and use it in a way that's consistent with your deepest aspirations. So I want to start tonight by telling you something you probably already know, which is that the Bible has a lot to say about money. And for those of us who read the Gospels and count things, it appears that after the kingdom of God, Jesus says more about money than about anything else. And the things he says about money are remarkable. In fact, he compares money to a rival deity, as if money is the credible competition for the God of Israel. And he does something with money that he does with no other spiritual force. He gives it the name of a rival god, Mammon. We're not exactly sure what Mammon is. Was there a god in the ancient world by that name, or did Jesus just make up a name to say money is this powerful that we need to give it a divine identity? The point, though, is he says money competes for our attention, for our devotion, for our affection, for our time with God, and that we cannot serve two masters. Either we will love one and hate the other, or cling to one and despise the other. And then that remarkable statement, you cannot serve God and Mammon. So I want to start tonight with a question that I hope those of you who are close to a keyboard and can join us in chat will answer, because what you answer will probably determine what I say next. And here's the question that I'd like us to wrestle with. If Mammon were your God, how would you know? So think about that for a moment. If Mammon were your God, if money were your God, how would you know? So if you have an idea, why don't you type that in so that we can see what you are thinking? If money were your God, and you were interested in saying, well, is money my God? How would you test that? And how would you know whether money were your God or not? So we'll look for anything you want to send us right now. How would you know if money were your God? It's a question worth taking seriously, isn't it? Because Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. So let's think about this for a moment. What are some of the ways that we relate to a God? What are some of the ways that we can identify what is supreme or divine in our own lives? So one answer to this question might be, how much do you think about money? Another question might be, what do you reach for when you have a problem? Another question might be, what is it that you cannot bear to be separated from? Or what is a source of delight for you? I think for me, when I ask the question, what is it that I reach for when I'm in trouble? Money is always very, very close at hand. As if I just have enough, then I'll be insulated from problems. If I just have enough, then things won't get to me. Thank you, Suzanne, and others of you out there who are thinking about this question. She says, it would be the first goal of the day and my efforts would celebrate it. There you go. There's a notion of what it is that is the organizing principle of our life. I did an experiment recently where I looked at how many times during the day do I push the bank app on my phone. And I tried to pay attention to when is it that I check my bank balance, or when is it that I want to know how much money that I have in my bank account. And it seems like the reflex to go check that out has something to do with when I'm feeling bored or lonely, or when I'm have some anxious thought. Sometimes I just notice without thinking about it, I'll just look and see how much money have I got right now. So this idea, if you let yourself ask the question, if money were my God, how would I know? You start to, in many cases, come up with some relatively uncomfortable discoveries that, in fact, we do think about it a lot. And we think about it in the context of fear or of status or of security or of ambition or of protection from other people. And the more that we think of money as the thing that keeps us safe or gives us a sense of purpose, then the more it is playing that central role in our lives. I think another way of judging whether money is your God is how many of money's claims do we take for granted and never test? For instance, one of the central claims that money makes is that things are scarce and they have to be allocated by competition. Another one of money's claims is that people are useful to us because they do things for us or get us what we want. Another of money's claims is that things need to be balanced, that in order for me to be confident that I'm going to get from you what I need to be making sure that I'm giving you things that you find valuable, so that mutually beneficial exchange is what keeps us connected and safe. So taking these assumptions for granted is something you do if you're immersed in an economy like ours, in a society like ours, simply because we rehearse them all the time. We think about scarcity regularly because it's just in the water. It's in all the conversation around us. We think about competition because that's just a fact of life for most of us. That is, since it's how our economy works, we absorb it as if it were true. You may even find yourself in some of your close relationships acting out of the need to balance things or out of a sense of competition, making sure that you're sufficiently valuable to people that you can count on them being there for you. I mean, these are kinds of logics that money wants to make sure we're very well invested in. Because when I'm invested in scarcity and competition and the usefulness of other people, then I'm going to stay very engaged in the dynamic of getting, spending, building my reputation, and all of the practices that make me valuable in a world where money is God. Now, it's funny that these assumptions, these things that we take for granted, the sort of faith of Mammon, run completely contrary to a lot of the things that Jesus offers us in the gospel. That is, Jesus wants us to test these claims to discover if, in fact, there aren't other things that describe the truest realities of our life that when we discover them are, in fact, liberating and give us the freedom to love and the freedom to love God and our neighbor. And yet we don't do that whenever we are fearful, when we're sensing scarcity, and when we are in competition with each other. But Jesus offers us a different way of thinking about these things. I want to look with you at trying to take seriously, if we wanted to describe the theology of money, what would it look like? And so on the screen now, I drew a diagram to try to compare the theology that comes from money and its assumptions with the theology that Jesus offers us in the gospel. And so I go across this diagram from the left to the right to look at how does money answer these questions differently than Jesus does. So if you start in the far left column here with some description of the human condition, we're trying to account for suffering. We're trying to account for injustice and violence and our own experience of emptiness and guilt. And in particular, what do we do with the reality of death? So if this then is the set of experiences that demand some sort of answer, let's look at how money and Jesus answer those differently. So in the next column, in Jesus, the notion is one of sin, which is a kind of dislocation, separation, or being disconnected from each other. And that the thing that we are seeking to overcome that is love, which is experienced in reconciliation. The diagnosis that we get from capitalism and the modern economy is that really the problem is mortality, that the issue is scarcity, that there's not enough, that things are going to run out, and that there is an insufficiency that has got to be overcome by creating more. So down here we have a sense in which we are fearful of loss. We are trying to fix the problem, and our action here is to defend ourselves in the meantime from that which would take from us what we can't afford to part with. So I got these terms from Sam Wells in his book, A Nazareth Manifesto. This notion of dislocation is very different from this notion of mortality, and the way you approach the human condition is going to be radically different, depending on whether you think the issue is our separation from one another and from God, or whether you think the problem is we just don't have enough and we've got to make sure that scarcity is overcome. If you look at the next column, what is the diagnosis of human nature? What does each of these ways of seeing the world think about human beings? And so the classical Christian notion of a disordered desire being the nature of human beings, that we have reason, but it's clouded, and that what we are doing in Christ is having our desires reordered so that we are able to love in the way that we are made. Whereas in the world of money, we really do rely on our reason to determine what it is that we want and how it is that we solve problems. And the problem here is one of demand and supply being imbalanced. And so desire is taken as given in the economic model rather than something that is problematic that needs to be rehabilitated. And that self-interest is the thing that we can rely on to give us good outcomes. That is, people are going to try to get what they want by making things that other people want, and the end result is a balance in which we have more and more stuff available. This is the notion of free market economics creating prosperity. Now, some people in the classic Christian traditions would probably consider our notion of self-interest not so different from the classical notion of greed. And in fact, the market paradox that economists talk about is we rely on the market to give us prosperity and give us an opportunity to make and trade and have a profitable, prosperous economy. And yet, if we really rely on self-interest, we're going to have more people cheating, trying to take things from each other, trying to work around the rules so that in the end people don't trust the system and it can't actually deliver the desired result. So the idea here is that when we talk about the theology of Jesus, we start with desire as itself an opportunity for redemption and transcendence and God's work in our lives. Whereas when we talk about the economic assumptions, desire is simply taken as given, and the problem becomes the technical one of how do we get self-interested people working in alignment so that they're meeting each other's respective desires. So what then do we do about all of this? The next column talks about ascesis, or practice. And of course, in Christ, our practice is communal worship, prayer, and table fellowship that helps to become a channel through which our desires are reordered and we are taught what to love. Whereas the ascesis in the world of money is that we're going to have a free market that transforms greed into prosperity. And we have advertising that constructs our desire and teaches us what to desire and shows us where to get it and locks us in a cycle in which we consume and dispose of stuff so that we can make room to want more. In the world down here in which desire is taken as given, it also becomes the energy that keeps us engaged. And in the world of the economy, it is the constant impulse to shopping that provides excitement and keeps boredom and the fear of mortality at bay. Of course, the payoff of all of this is that we actually do get astonishing material prosperity out of the world of the free market economics. We also get a whole lot of pollution and inequality. And yet, as the economists are fond of saying, we haven't yet found a system that delivers prosperity at the scale that we enjoy it in Western economies. There's just not an alternative to this that seems to work as well. And yet, that's not the concern that Christians have. Our first focus is not on how to make the machine deliver the most goods, because this is not our notion of the human predicament. Because our notion is one of brokenness and dislocation. The focus of view of the world is that people are together. Whereas the telos of the economy is that we won't be fighting as much because we have enough stuff to meet people's desires. The economy can make enough to keep people satisfied, and desire is an end in itself. Now, the challenge here is, of course, this is never actually realized, that people who practice cultivating desire tend to always want more and tend to want things like coastal real estate or positions in organizations that are just in simply limited supply, and that practicing these muscles of competition eventually leads to dissatisfaction, envy, and in many cases the very violence that the moral philosophers who imagined the economy as a spiritual vehicle sought to avoid. So here's a way then of just beginning with a contrast, that the world of money is offering us one deal, whereas the theology of Jesus points to an entirely different way of being. Now, I'll be the first to confess that the world that's described in this row of this chart is the one that I'm living in most of the time, whereas this world up here is the one in which I recognize my deepest desires. So what do we do about that? Well, let's think about ascesis and how we practice making God God, as opposed to letting money be God. Because in spiritual practice, it is our prayer that provides perspective and spiritual integration with all of these vital life forces that are listed along the bottom of the chart. Money is an energy that connects us to other people. It's tied up with how we fit together in an earthly body. Our physical bodies, of course, are a source of our vitality and energy, and our relationships also. Each of these vital energies is a gift from God and an occasion for stewardship so that we may make ourselves available to one another in communion. And yet, if you take prayer out of this picture, then what you get is these vital energies become autonomous and rise to the level of being gods themselves. Money, for instance, we'll call it Mammon. That's the God that Jesus is talking about in the Gospels. We also have the physical body, which becomes the flesh, its own sort of autonomous way of being. And relationship, if divorced from Christ, it tends towards objectifying, that we have I-it relationships instead of I-thou. Once again, our focus being on how people are useful to us. So the practice here that we're talking about is how do we avoid living a life of worry, because each of these energies, as they become God for us, involves us in anxiety and worry about their loss, our anxiety about the loss of relationship, about the loss of the vitality of the body, and certainly about the scarcity of things, which is the kind of worry that attends money. I always found it interesting that Jesus made a point of saying that we shouldn't worry. In fact, it rises to the level of a commandment: do not worry. Do not worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. That always seemed to me to be a little cruel, to command people not to worry. I mean, worry is probably 2/3 of my spirituality. And so if I'm not going to worry, what am I going to do? And it seems like Jesus gives us the answer, and Paul reiterates the answer: do not worry, but make your petitions known to God. Do not worry, but give thanks. Do not worry, but rejoice. This idea that somehow it is the reintegration of these vital energies through prayer that puts them back in a relationship that doesn't involve worry, but involves praise, rejoicing, thanksgiving, and a sense that we are in God's economy rather than simply the closed system of Mammon. So what I'd like to do with the rest of this webinar is to show you how we are practicing testing the claims of Mammon with my community at the Seminary of the Southwest, where we're trying to test each of these vital energies and our relationship with them to make sure that they are serving our efforts to live out our vocations and experience our unity with one another in Christ. So I have questions up here on the board. This is the first step that you can take in your own spiritual practice to testing the claims of Mammon. And the questions that we ask are come from different places. First of all, you could take a commandment of Jesus's, like do not worry, or a commandment to give to everyone who asks of you, or the commandment to sell your possessions. And take a commandment that is interesting to you and scary to you, and one that maybe you've just always driven by because it seems naive or unrealistic. Next, you could take one of the hard teachings of Jesus, like you cannot serve God and Mammon, or that unless you forgive your neighbor, right, God will not forgive you. Take one of these hard teachings from Jesus that really appeals to you, that scares you, that excites you, that you've found yourself drawn to but don't know what to do about. You could do the same thing with an obstacle to your vocation. So for instance, perhaps you find yourself spending more money than you should and worrying about money because of practices you have of spending. Or perhaps you work so much to make money that there's not money left for or there's not time left and energy for your family and other relationships. Or perhaps there's a spiritual aspiration, that there's something that you see in the Gospels, such as to lend without expecting a return. And you see yourself in that commandment or that teaching. You say, I want to live in a world where I trust that God provides all that I need. It's an aspiration you have for experiencing the presence of God, or for your enactment of your faith in your daily life. And one of these different portals for you, a commandment, a hard teaching, an obstacle to vocation, or a spiritual aspiration, is a good way to get started in the practice of small experiments. So in the article, I say the first step in this practice that we're developing is to find a point of tension. And the point of tension that you're looking for could be in one of these four things: a commandment that you don't know how to keep, a hard teaching that you can't let go of but don't know what to do with, some habit in your own life that you just don't seem to be able to get on top of, or some aspiration that you want to draw closer to. So pay attention to some source of tension. And I'll give you an example of some of the questions that draw some of my friends into spiritual practice with money. So, for example, a question might be, can I give to everyone who asks? Or can I give away my possessions? Or what if I invite people who can't repay me? Another one of Jesus' teachings. What will happen if I do that? What if I ask for what I need? Another thing that Jesus tells us to do. Is mammon real? Is wealth really a spiritual risk? What if I do not worry about money? When am I spending unconsciously? So these are questions that come up that are points of tension that draw us into spiritual practice. So let's start with some question. And once you've got a question, you are ready to do what we call it, Southwest, a small experiment in faith. And I want to show you exactly how you create one of these. And then what I hope is those of you who are interested in seeing how this practice might work for something you care about might work with me through the chat box to create a small experiment for yourself that you can take from this webinar. So when we're talking about small experiments, we're talking about very small changes that interrupt a habit and give you a chance to learn from some fresh experience. So these small experiments have to be small. We're not talking about going on a diet or saving 10% of your income. We're not talking about any of these resolutions that we make to reform ourselves. We're talking rather about small things that we do that work rather like prayer. So Jesus was very big on money experiments. Some of the ones he recommended were quite large, but you can imagine small versions of them. So here's a few of them. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. A big experiment that didn't work so well, literally, for the rich one who came to Jesus and asked. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and the companion experiment to give to God what belongs to God. Give to everyone who asks of you. I like this one from Luke 10. Carry no bag, no purse, no stick or sandals. How about the experiment at the triumphal entry? Go untie that donkey and tell people the master needs it. Or give in secret. Don't tell people what you're doing. These are some experiments that surely Jesus is telling us, try this and see what happens. Try this as a way of discovering your deeper aspirations, and also for revealing that money doesn't have the power you think it does. And always the conclusion of these experiments is this: come follow me. Go sell your possessions and come and follow me. So I want to show you how we put together a small experiment, and I'm going to use in this example because this happened in one of my classes, the teaching about giving to everyone who asks, because that really does threaten the heart of money's faith, which is that things are scarce and that competition is necessary for survival. So let's try some small experiment in this notion of giving to everyone who asks. So I've got here on the slide the matrix that we use to create small experiments, and I want to show you how we use this. So it has two columns. The top row is where you track your behavior, and the bottom row is where you track your belief. And belief and behavior are related around faith because there's usually some story that comes up for us as we try to interrupt a habit, and that story usually involves some notion of threat, that we're not going to be okay unless we keep doing what we're doing. So let's use the example of giving to everyone who asks, and I'll show you how this fits together. So giving to everyone who asks is an aspiration. It's something that you're probably not doing right now, and yet somehow this teaching of Jesus appeals to you. So when in the Sermon on the Mount he says, give to everyone who asks of you, you recognize, yes, that is central to the beauty of this faith. This is something that I aspire to live this way, to live with the confidence and the groundedness in the gospel and this sense of abundance and generosity that I can give to everyone who asks. All right, so that's the first step. The second step in crafting a small experiment is to pay attention to what you're doing now. And the third thing, teaching. So I want to put both of these up on the board at once. When I asked the student who said, my aspiration is to follow this teaching of Jesus, that I could give to everyone who asks. And she had a lot of energy around this. And I said, well, what are you doing now? And she said, well, I'm actually not giving right now. I'm not giving. In fact, I'm looking away when I encounter people in need. So there you go. Already she's found a tension between a future in which she sees herself rooted in this sense of abundance in the gospel, the abundance that comes in Christ. And she sees a tension between that and what she's actually doing now, which is holding on to things and, in fact, looking away. So this was her observation based on current behavior. So this is what you do. Find a source of tension and then pay attention to what you're doing now. And then the third step in this work is to ask yourself, what would happen if you actually did this thing that you aspire to do? What would happen? And she said down here, if I in fact gave to everyone who asked, I would be exhausted and broke. And I asked her, well, what would that mean? What would that mean to run out of money or to give everything you had away? And she said, it would mean that my parents were right about me, that I'm irresponsible, that I can't be trusted with money, and that I won't grow up. And this was, in fact, a very grown woman who was responsible, who yet still had this story, because for her, money is about security, money is about responsibility, money is about maturity in the eyes of her parents. And so she has a belief that if she were to open her resources to everyone who asked, she would be exhausted and broke. And I can't say that I disagree with her. It certainly is a fear of mine that if I flout the principle of scarcity on which our economic life runs, that I will myself be taken advantage of and depleted. So I'm identifying with her. The fourth step in crafting a small experiment is to ask, what would I need to believe to actually be able to live this way? So what kind of belief might enable us to give to everyone who asks? And it's usually going to be in contrast with the belief that's holding our current habit in place. And so in this particular case, the student says, I would have to believe I had something for everyone. I would have to believe I have enough to share. And so she identified a belief that would animate a different way of being with people. And in fact, one that is very consistent with what Jesus is inviting her to believe in the gospel. So this is what's exciting to me, is that there is a belief that is rooted in the culture that we live in, And there is a countercultural belief that is a possibility that Jesus offers that doesn't get a lot of traction in our life because we don't ever test it. So the question is, how might we test this possibility? And so we looked at her diagram here. I am not seeing need. I'm looking away. We looked at her current behavior, and we found the smallest thing she might do to test this belief that by giving, she would be exhausted and broke. And she herself came up with the experiment. We were looking back at the Sermon on the Mount, and she said, aha, this passage doesn't say money. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give my full attention to everyone who is asking. I'm going to give my full attention to everyone who is asking. I'm going to be faithful to this commandment, not by giving all my money away, but by giving something to everyone who's asking, and that is going to be my full attention. And so she came back after a week of doing this experiment, and her classmates said, what happened? Did you give people money? And she said, most people aren't asking for money. They aren't asking for money. She said, in giving my attention, people were being seen by me. And she said, and they told me things. They talked with me. We were connected. And so rather than her experiencing that moment as one in which there's not enough, she was experiencing it as a moment in which reconnection was possible. People were talking with her. They were offering her their stories. They were asking her to be heard rather than just for money. In fact, by giving people money, she would have stopped the conversations that she said were the beginning of her interest in giving more of herself to others. So finding this experiment, notice her experiment was not to give everyone money because that would have been too big. Her experiment was to find a way that had a cost and a risk that she could manage, that responded to the commandment on sort of starter terms. So I find this really an interesting practice. I'm putting up here a worksheet that we use with our students and with each other to create experiments. So we go back to the 4 quadrants of this box: behavior and belief, and the present, and the aspiration or the possibility. And you can start in any box. We started in this box up here: give to everyone who asks. And what do you wish you were doing? What is the teaching in the gospel that's exciting? And then from that box, you can go to any other box. Well, what are you actually doing now? I'm not giving. I'm not looking. Or what are you afraid would happen if you did do this? I'd be broke and embarrassed. What belief would free you to act in this way? So the questions that are in this diagram right here are the ones that we use for this sort of spiritual direction practice that helps people craft small experiments around beliefs that compete with the beautiful countercultural possibilities that Jesus offers in the gospel. I'll show you some of the money experiments that people are running to test the power of mammon. I call these experiments in risking and refraining. Risking is something that you're going to put out there, and refraining is something that you're going to stop doing for a little bit and see what happens. It's sort of like a form of fast. So this work comes from looking both at the classical Ignatian examen and the way in which the examination of our conscience and our actions makes room for the Holy Spirit to convict us and give us tests that we can run of where we're trusting the Spirit and where we're resisting. And also the work of Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, particularly this book, Immunity to Change, looks at this idea of limiting beliefs and how the cultural assumptions that we have about what makes us valuable, what makes us safe, how we get things done, actually can limit our ability to be fully present and cooperative and fruitful, especially in our relationships with others. So these 2 works we've been drawing on in the seminary for this practice. So here's some experiments with money that you might find interesting. One of the most important ones is simply track everything you spend for a week. And the insight that comes from seeing patterns of what you're buying, how much you're spending, and when you're spending will always reveal something to you. So it's a practice of awareness. And in our Money as Metaphor class at the Southwest, at the seminary, all of the students track their purchases during the semester. And it is always an occasion for discovery, because there are always unconscious habits we have about money that will be exposed and become an occasion for curiosity and discovery when we start tracking our spending. Another experiment that you can run is try a day where you just don't buy anything and see what happens. Watch when it is you want to spend money. Watch what you do when you don't spend money. Watch how knowing you're not going to spend money for a day changes all the other things that you do. And what do you do with the time you would have otherwise spent looking for stuff online or going to buy something? I had a student who said that she spent money to avoid boredom, and we asked her, "What are you afraid would happen if you didn't go to the mall and shop?" And she said, "I think I would just feel alone and empty." And so rather than doing the big experiment of I'm not going to the mall, because that would have been a big change for her, she decided to go to the mall and see if she could take God with her. So she had the mall prayer written at the bottom of this slide: "Lord, you are with me here and always." I asked her, "What happened when you did that practice?" And she said, I didn't buy anything that I regretted later." That seemed like an interesting outcome to that experiment. Sometimes just paying attention to the hands or the eyes of the person with whom you're passing money gets us out of this world in which we are instruments to each other purely in the way we are connected through commerce. That the human beings that are there in our full embodied form, just remembering that, you might discover changes some thoughts you have about money and the economy and finance. An experiment that was transformative for me was when my mentor told me, I was in my 20s and I was really concerned about whether to give money to people on the street or not. And he said, "It doesn't matter whether you give them money. What matters is that you look in their eyes." And I said, "I don't want to do that. That's creepy." And he said, "Where else do you think you're going to see God?" And so if you don't look in their eyes, he said, you won't find the answer to that question of what to do. And so I started doing that. And what I found myself doing was sometimes I would talk to people. Sometimes I would give them money. Sometimes I would go get a sandwich with them. One time I got a guy a bus ticket. The conversation led somewhere. And many times I said, "I don't have anything for you today," or "I have conversation if you'd like." What was funny, one day I was driving home and I had a pop-top can of tuna in my grocery bag, and a man that was standing at an intersection with a sign, when I rolled down my window, I said, "I've got tuna if you want it." And he laughed. He liked that answer. It was as though I wasn't feeling guilty. He wasn't manipulating me. We were just two human beings on the street corner being together. And when I told friends about that, many of them started carrying tuna, because I think what they really wanted was connection, not a technical solution to the problem of people asking for money. So this is something that we learn in community. I encourage you to think about assumptions you have about money and how you might test them, and to share what you're doing with friends. If you are in an adult ed group at church, if you have just friends in your neighborhood that you have spiritual or philosophical conversations with, this is a really good opportunity, I think, for us to get to deeper levels of connection with each other by asking, what do you think about giving to people? When do you give? When is it hard to give? What do you think would happen if you did? How have you tested that? And what kind of satisfaction, what have we spent money on that has been most satisfying? What have we spent it on that's least satisfying? Just being able to ask these questions of each other, tell each other about the experiments that we're running, and learning community. So this leads to the kind of integration that makes these vital energies available to us for our vocation. I've been talking tonight about money, which is what the article is about. But there are also practices around physical vitality, things that the world says about our bodies that are very different from the way Jesus talks about them in the Gospels, and things about our relationships, about forgiveness, reconciliation, about our usefulness to each other, about honesty, that the world has conventions about, that our society teaches us and we take for granted, but that are also really occasions to test some of the richer possibilities of the gospel by running experiments. And doing this, which is a form of praying with our whole lives, is a way of making sure that these energies are in the service of our highest aspirations in Christ. So let me see if anybody would like to either ask a question or to propose a belief about money that we could run an experiment around, and I'll see what we can do improvisationally to create something.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And apologies to those who are having some technical difficulties getting into the webinar room. Hopefully you've been able to get connected through Zoom or through our Facebook Live page. I know we have a bunch of folks that have tuned in through Facebook as an alternative. So if you have just come in after the introduction slides, the chat box is available on the upper left-hand side of your screen. If you press the chat button, that will prop a box open and you can type into that. For those of you joining us on Facebook, just go ahead and type into the comments and I will relay those over to Stephen. And while we're waiting, one question that I do have for you, Stephen, is where do you see common pitfalls when people are trying to develop their sort of experiments? I mean, there's very intriguing ideas that you put out for us and various wonderful examples, but typically, do you see any sort of things that people get tripped up with?
Yeah, the biggest thing I see is people that are trying to do things that are too big, that they're looking to use this not as a spiritual practice, but as a way to fix a problem. So, for instance, I have people say, well, I want to run an experiment in which I'm able to increase my savings. That's too big. That's I'm anxious about my retirement. I don't think that I'm saving enough money, so I need a way to save more. So that's now become a technical problem. How are we going to do that? The spiritual puzzle is always going to be addressed through awareness and experimenting with different thoughts. So before you try to save more money or create a forced savings plan or do something drastic like that, something that's big and heroic and solves a problem, why don't you try to explore what it is that's going on right now when you imagine saving more money. So if we said, let's imagine you were going to put 5% of everything you got into a savings account. And then you would say, well, then I wouldn't have enough. I'll be able to do that now. That is, that's so important that it's more important to you than saving. And I had a friend who wants to save money, but that in doing a lot of entertaining is a very big value for him. I want to have people to my house. I want to host parties. I want to take people to dinner. And so the idea of trying to save more money was competing with him with this other good thing, which is sharing with his friends and being hospitable. So the belief that he wanted to test was, I believe that hospitality requires money, or that I should spend money on other people as I get it as a way of expressing hospitality. And instead, what he decided to do for his small experiment was, rather than trying to save money, he experimented with ways of showing hospitality that didn't cost much money. So what would happen if, instead of hosting a dinner for people, I had people over for snacks and something very inexpensive, or had a potluck or something. And these were things that ran against. And so what he really discovered was that it wasn't really hospitality that was driving him. It was this feeling that he was providing and spending, that he was doing something for other people that made him valuable. And once he figured out that there were ways of having community and fellowship with people that he didn't control and get a particular sort of credit for, then he got curious about this practice of spending money that was getting in the way of saving. So we don't want you to immediately do something that's related to reform. We don't want you to fix a problem that Jesus said that's hard to believe and find the smallest possible way to test it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Again, would invite any questions or comments anyone has. In Zoom, we're opening up the chat box, which is on the upper left-hand side of your screen, and on Facebook, you can just put your questions or comments right into the comments in the post. And a follow-up question, if you don't mind, to that. This can be a rather difficult subject for people to talk about. Do you have any suggestions for those of us who want to bring this back to our congregations in terms of like an adult forum, or in terms of via sermon, or do you have any particular ways or methods of introducing into
I think that's
congregational setting?
Yeah. You know, I have had good luck in congregations starting with the question, why is this so hard for us to talk about? And what are the conversations we wish we could have about money? And what difference do we think it would make for us if we could talk about these things? And what kind of conversations, where might we start the conversation that would feel safe or safer? You know, when I talk to priests and preachers about this, I always emphasize that because money is God for most of us, the fact that we're not talking about it is missing the real promise of why we come to church. We come to church to find another God, a God in which there's more freedom and love than the God that we are living with every day. And Jesus doesn't seem to be shy about saying, all right, here's the God that I am in, and here's the competing God out here that we slip into so easily. And let me show you how they're different. I mean, think about how many of the miracles and parables are directly about confronting Mammon. So feeding 5,000 people, that is overturning the claim of scarcity. You know, the parable about the man who goes to another country to be made king. That's a story about the power of money to keep people intimidated and to keep them playing along in a system that's exploitative. You know, the Bible is full, and the Gospels are full of rich stories about money. And so I want to start with my congregation by asking them, what makes this conversation hard? What do we wish we could talk about? Where do you think we might get if we had that discussion? What's the promise of it? Where can we start? And then start looking at just some of these miracles and parables that challenge scarcity, the usefulness of people, competition, all the claims of money, and then see if gently we can't turn that back to, so where in our lives are we encountering this God, this Mammon that competes with us, that gives us its beliefs, and where are we living those beliefs? And what might it be like? What kind of experiment might we run there? I think that the other thing that's interesting, Brendan, is to move from having the economy is not going to change tomorrow. And so it's what we've got to deal with, and telling people that money is bad is not, you're not going to get anywhere with that, especially since we're all so invested in our identities and in that story. I think instead the approach is to say, let's try and experiment and test if this is true. Is it really true that I don't have something for everyone? Is it really true that scarcity is the driver, is the realest thing there is? Let's try some experiments and see if that's true. And I think that can excite a congregation.
Wonderful. And to follow up on that, how do you see any ways of being able to bring this to younger people, namely children and youth, or do you see the same principles as applying to bringing this to the younger generations?
Yeah. Our relationship with money is mediated through spending, saving, giving, and earning. Right? Those are the four gestures by which we connect with money. And so I think with youth, you can talk about those things. You can talk with children about giving and let them see, how giving connects them to someone else, and talk to children about what was it like, what happened when we gave him that, how did you feel? How did you know he was happy? Did he see you? What do you think, what difference do you think it made that you saw him and he saw you? The way we talk to children about the encounters they have with money can help them see money as a tool for deeper connection rather than another way to be good. And so when we go in the store and they want to buy things, I think, having conversations with kids about what's it going to be like to have that? And what are you going to do with it? And let's talk about this toy, that you don't play with anymore. What happened with that? Not to judge the kid or to make them feel bad about something, but just to provoke curiosity in them about how desire works around spending money. And then around saving money, to get them to think about both that God takes care of us, and that saving is an opportunity for us to imagine things and make them real. And then talk to children about the things they imagine and make sure that their imagination is connecting them to people rather than insulating them from them. So I think there are lots of very gentle and beautiful ways to talk to children about the things that money does, and always put it in the context of connection with people and being with people and loving them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful content. We are just about out of time, but want to thank everyone for joining us. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties that anyone may have encountered with connecting this evening. Recording has been made and will be posted to ECF Auto Practices. And I just want to make a last request to everyone who's participated this evening that in the next couple of seconds, you'll be getting a link to a survey in your inbox. So please take a moment to go to your phone or your email and on your desktop and click on that survey link and just spend a few moments providing us some feedback about this evening's webinars. We read each and every single comment that we receive and use this for planning our future webinars and in-person presentations. Thanks again, Stephen. Thanks all for attending. God bless and Godspeed in your ministries.